The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
There we go. Okay, I'm going to start all over again. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay, great. There we go. I think everyone can hear me. Well, okay, so we have in front of us a Reload for Retain 2.0 slide deck. We will not be living in that the entire webinar. I really hope that this is going to be helpful for you. Whether or not you're interested in Reload for Retain, we're going to talk about backing up Retain in general in our topics, but we're also going to demonstrate Reload for Retain and help you to see that solution. So the first thing that I want to do is I actually want to break away from my slideshow, and I want to go inside of GroupWise, and I want to create an email, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside of Retain, and I'm going to go ahead and dredge that out and get that into Retain. And I'm doing that for our demonstration purposes later on, but I want you to see that I actually created the message and that it gets all the way into Retain and that it gets backed up to multiple locations vis-a-vis Reload for Retain. So I'm just going to log in as a user that I've got in this test system here. And I'm going to compose a message, okay? So message sent today, November 3rd, 2016, okay? All right, so there's the subject, there's the body, and for good measure, let's put in a attachment too, okay? So there we have a complete message. Let's send that, okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into Retain, and I'm going to kick off a dredge, okay, just manually inside of Retain, and so let me just do that here, and I'm going to say refresh job cache now. We're going to go over to status, 4, 3, 2, 1, and oh gee, okay, we're waiting for that to come over here. Let's twiddle the schedule one more time and see if somehow that resolves the issue. Nope. Okay, let's try this again. Those of you that are familiar with Retain, you know we have to do this sometimes. Getting it to do a dredge on demand. Oh, gee. Okay, so what have I done wrong? I'm fiddling with this, and I'm going to do that, and just something like that. Save changes, go here, and there we go. Okay, finally we got it to kick in, and we're seeing here we've got 2 mailboxes in this little test system, and we got the items archived. I'm assuming those got into the archive. Let's check that out. Let's go to search messages. Let's go to browse, and let's go the last 3 days, and let's go to this user's mailbox. Ah, there we go. Okay, so you can see this message sent today is inside of retain. Okay, now I'm going to let all the magical things happen in the background that happen, and so I'm not going to. Okay, so I kicked off a backup here too, but I'm going to go ahead then and go back to my slideshow, and let's get into reload for retain. Okay, and again, the reason I wanted you to see that was I wanted you to see that I've created an item, and that item will be replicated to our reload for retain servers. So let's go ahead and just talk about retain for a moment from the standpoint of architecture, and the reason we need to understand that architecture is we have to understand the architecture for how to back up retain, okay? And so there's basically three components to retain when it comes from the data standpoint. Of course, you've got the software too, but the data, there's three components. You have a database, and the database has just got a bunch of metadata. It's the glue between all of the data inside of retain. So the database plays that key role. When you log in, you're using the database. When you look at stuff, you're using the database. The database portion of retain is very important. Of course, as you know, the database can be in a variety of different database formats, and so that's perfectly fine. But that's the first component is the database. The next component is the archive files, blobs we often call them. That's the actual data. So database is metadata. The actual data, you know, the message body contents, attachments, and so forth, those are spun out in retain into the archive location as blob files in and amongst 16.7 million directories potentially that are maintained in the archive location, okay? And then thirdly, there's indexes, and the indexes have the ability to, you know, all the words that are spread in and amongst the messages are kept in the indexes, which is extremely powerful, particularly in retain 4x. Those indexes are extremely fast. You get Google type searches. It's very, very powerful, okay? Anyway, so that's the architecture of retain. Now, backing up retain, you know, what do you need to do? And again, this applies to you whether or not you're going to get reload for retain or whatever solution you might be using. And so it's very important that you back up your database, okay? If you lose your database, there's absolutely no way that we can stitch together the rest of your system. Even though you might have archives and indexes and stuff, it doesn't do you any good without a database. So your database needs to be backed up. Now, pardon me, for customers that are on Oracle and Microsoft SQL, there's lots of backup solutions. In fact, you probably have even some great backup to the cloud solutions for those databases, okay? So we're really not too worried about that. And in fact, typically when a customer, particularly when a customer has Oracle, you know, they've made the expenditures to have a proper backup. They might have a master-slave scenario, all kinds of solutions out there that I'd recommend. Make sure that that's backed up. Now, for MySQL, a good way that you can get a backup is to do a MySQL dump. Another way that you might create a backup of your database is a continuous backup with a master-slave architecture, and then you could take and you can use that architecture on all of the database platforms. Let's say, for example, in MySQL, you could then dump off of the slave versus the master database, or you could dump off the master. That's perfectly fine. But what's really nice is you have that real-time replication of your database with the master-slave architecture. If you do use a master-slave architecture, don't point your retain server at your slave replica. You would only do that in a disaster recovery scenario, and the reason is because of some things called the audit table inside of retain. If you anyways, I don't want to get too much into the particulars, but don't point to a slave replica. Only do so in a disaster recovery scenario, and then you want to dump that slave replica and replicate it over to where the master was originally. So, okay, that's backing up your databases. The next thing is to back up the archive data, the blobs. Now, those must be backed up. It isn't as catastrophic if they're not backed up, but in the sense that at least you have the metadata, but you really don't have any content. And if you've been archiving, metadata is nice, but you really want to have the content of your messages that have been archived into retained. So I don't want to say that the database is more important, but it is. But the archive data is right there, right behind it. You got to make sure that that data is backed up. If you lose blob files, then you lose the message content. And again, the challenge with backing up retain for a lot of customers is that those 16.7 million directories full of these blobs, and backups can be very slow for certain solutions because they have to iterate through all those directories and look to see if there's new files, and then they also need to determine if any of the files have changed. Now, you and I know, or at least I know, and perhaps you know, that nothing ever changes in the blobs. New blobs are added and perhaps blobs are deleted, but blobs never change. And so a lot of backup software doesn't know that, and so they go looking for deltas inside of blob files, and that's a needless, fruitless effort because nothing ever changes. And so that's really the primary reason that I made Reload for Retain. Was there was an outfit that said, hey, could you put this together for us, because backing up our retain system's taken us about 40 hours each iteration, and we're supposed to have a backup every 24 hours to meet our compliance issues. This was a bank, and so Reload for Retain, they're backing up their pretty sizable system. They've got about 3,000 users or so, and they're using Retain for email, for mobile, and so forth. And so they have a sizable system, and they're backing up the data in less than an hour a day. Typically about half an hour is how long the backups go on with Reload for Retain. So, okay, now the third item then is the index data. Now the index files, they're important to back up because if you had to recreate them, it could take quite a long period of time to recreate them. Now the good news is if you did lose your indexes or somehow you weren't backing them up, you can recreate them. So they're not, I wouldn't call them critical, but they are still important components of your retained system. And if you didn't have the indexes backed up, if you ever had a disaster recovery scenario, even though you've got all this data there, good data, it wouldn't be searchable until such time that you had recreated the indexes. And for some customers, that can take quite a while. We've even had one particular customer that it took months to recreate their indexes. So it's still important to back up your indexes. Okay, so now let's talk about how you're backing up your retain system. These are kind of these aren't exact quotes, but this is the kind of responses I've gotten is well, retain is our backup, and for a lot of people it really is. I mean, it's not really a backup of your email system, for example. If you were to lose your email system, let's say you had GroupWise or whatever it be, if you were to lose that, Retain certainly couldn't act as your email system. But we do have a lot of customers that they're going, okay, well, our long-term backup of our email is Retain, which is a great idea, and that's great, but you can't say, well, it's the backup, retains the backup. Well, you need to have a backup of your retain system because you've got so much in that basket. You got to make sure that it's backed up properly. And we've got a lot of customers that don't have a proper backup of their retain system, and we really hope that Reload for Retain will help them to be able to do that. Or the notion that, well, we've got VMware, so it's backed up. Well, okay, let's talk about that. But and then another is, well, it's on the SAN, and that's backed up also. So let me ask you a question then. If you think you have a good backup solution in place, can you challenge your backup? And here's the idea of challenging your backups. And my question is, can you do this easily? How easily can you do this? Can you bring up your backed up retain server, log into retain, test the databases? So when you log in, that's testing the database. And can you browse for items? Can you search for items? That's testing the the backup of the indexes and so forth. And then can you open items go in and open a blob file, an attachment, or a message body, see that you can see the message body, confirm that you can open the attachments. And so a lot of times with backups, and I saw this when I saw this with another product that I created called Reload for GroupWise, that a lot of times people have a cold backup solution, and it's basically, it's there for, hey, if ever we had a disaster or ever we needed to go back to backup to get some component, sure enough, it's sitting over there as best we know. And I call that a cold backup solution because they have no mechanism to really challenge the backup. And so then what happens is the day that they have the disaster, they then discover, oh shoot, this really doesn't work. And so that's something that Reload for Retain 2.0 was really designed to do, is to help you to challenge your backup. And we will be doing that today. We'll demonstrate that, and that's why I dredged out that item and kicked off a backup and so forth, so that you could see that this data will get backed up. So we're going to talk about multiple topics here and some really cool things in Reload for Retain 2.0. First off, it's a complete backup solution for your MySQL database from your retain server, or if your MySQL database is on another server than your retain server, it'll still back that up, the retain component of that. It's a hyper-fast backup of retain archive files. I talked about this customer for whom we created Reload for Retain originally. It backs up a retain system much faster than other solutions would. And new feature in Reload for Retain 2.0 is push-button disaster recovery. We're going to demonstrate these things for you, so it'll be really good to see. Now, another really exciting feature, it's called real-time backups, or software mirroring. So here's the idea, is as soon as things are added into Retain, if you've set up the mirroring agent, which is just part of Reload for Retain, if you've set that up, it will mirror your data over to wherever you'd like it mirrored to, up to three servers, up to 3 Reload for Retain servers it will mirror the data over to. And so that's super powerful because, I don't know if you've seen, there's a lot of talk about that backup is dead, and that's not entirely true. It's kind of a promotional thing for certain vendors, but it's a reasonable thought, and it's the idea of just getting a backup once a day, or maybe intraday, a lot of times isn't sufficient for people. They want to have a fully replicated version of the software, the data, and so forth to another server, or even another location, which is another thing that I'm really encouraging that people do, is to consider, a lot of times people have these big VMware farms or server rooms and so forth. Well, what if there was like a flood, a little fire, and the sprinkler system goes off and waters all the servers? and you know, what would you do in that kind of scenario? And so I think it's important to consider an offsite solution, and reload for retain really bodes well for that kind of a scenario. So, and that's what we're showing here on the slide is that you can back up to on-site, off-site, to a partner cloud, all three of those or just one of those, whatever you choose to do. And so here's a slide that shows that idea of pushing the data to 3 other locations. And then we're going to demonstrate for you that you can easily challenge your backup solution. Reload for retain can back up your retain on both Linux and Windows, so the platform you have is no problem. You can define up to 20 backup jobs, and it's a very flexible architecture in reload for retain, so technically you could actually replicate your retain server to up to 60 other locations. Not that you'd want to do so, but I'm just saying it's a very forward-thinking architecture, and because it's so easy to challenge your backups are actually usable. You could actually use your backup server for retained tasks. So let's say, you know, you've got, you know, a big batch of things to do. Well, you can fire up the one retained server over on your backup system and do things with it while your other retained server is, you know, servicing end users, or, you know, it's the point for dredging and so forth. So it's perfectly feasible to just go ahead and use the backup on the retained server. And so can you imagine telling your boss, you know, yeah, you know, I've demonstrated this year multiple times that our backup solution for retain works beautifully. And how did you do so? Well, every time you went in to do a search, you used the reload for retain server. It's very simple to do, and I'll demonstrate that for you. Some really key features to this newest version of Reload for Retain is, for those of you that are on MySQL, Reload for Retain will do a MySQL dump of your database, and then when it replicates it, when the agent replicates it over to the server can be designed to automatically import that MySQL database that was dumped. It can automatically import it into a database over on the Reload for Retain server. And so when you think about what that does for you is if ever you did have a disaster, okay, or for whatever reason you wanted to cut over to the Reload for Retain server, it doesn't have to be a disaster, the MySQL dump has been automatically imported in. You don't have to, one, take the steps to do so, which isn't too difficult, but you also, more particularly, don't have to wait for the time for that to come in because it's already been imported automatically for you. Okay, so that's a really great feature. And then there's this notion of auto reload of the retain server on the reload server. And so this is the idea that once the MySQL database has been imported in, for example, for those of you that are on MySQL, it'll just load up the retain on the reload server so that you literally have 2 simultaneous systems that can be running if you so choose. We already talked about the 20 backup jobs that you can do. Okay, so now we've done all of our talking. Let's now do a demonstration, okay? So let me just acquaint you with what we've got here. Of course, we've got our email system where we sent that message. You remember that we went in and we searched for the message, okay? There's the retain worker. Now, the reload for retain agent is installed right on the retain server. Let me just bring that to the forefront here for a moment, okay? This is the reload for retain agent software, and so this runs either right on your retain server or it can run on another server, but I've got it installed right to the retain server, and this reload for retain agent is configured with what's called the mirroring agent. Now the mirroring agent what it does is, I'm going to just go here and show you here, what happens is the mirroring agent sleeps for a minute at a time. That's configurable. You could tell it to sleep for 5 minutes or an hour or whatever it is that you want to do, but whatever interval you indicate, it sits there and it does just a very quick query to the database. It takes like a second, and that query helps them to determine if there's new data that's inside of the retain system that then needs to be mirrored to wherever you've configured your mirror to send things to. And so I'll just show you here. The mirroring agent is mirroring data to 2 servers. Okay, it's sending it to what's called the primary reload server and then the secondary reload server. Okay, and so those 2 servers are here and here. Those 2 servers have any data that's been sent mirrored to them. So if I were to go here, let's kick off a dredge one more time, and I do that wrong. Here, let's log out. And my VMware, okay, all right, user A, there we go. Okay, I'm going to do a message here, a user mirror this message, okay, and mirror this message, and let's do an attachment also. And so let's go to one that hasn't been used so far. So let's go here, and there we go. All right, so send. Okay, all right. Now I'm going to go into retain. Now, I'm just let's imagine that this is like a mobile message, and so a mobile message gets pushed in. You generally don't have to jiggle things like I have to here, but I'm gonna jiggle the handle and retain, and go over to the retain worker, refresh job cache now, status, and there we go. So it's going to dredge that item out, and once that gets dredged out, I'm going to show you here over on the reload for retain agent. It will shortly, it will see that item is inside of retain, and it will mirror that over to the reload for retain servers, this one and this one. Okay, so while we're waiting for that to happen, let's demonstrate something completely different. Okay, so here we are in the reload for retain server, and let's imagine that we have a disaster recovery scenario. Now let's imagine in this scenario that we didn't lose the database, but because the database is, say, on a totally different server, and so that might be the scenario in Microsoft SQL or Oracle or even MySQL. You don't have to have the MySQL database on the same server, although most of our customers do. But let's just imagine that that's the scenario. So the database is still good, but the retain server, we've lost the retain server, and so thus we've lost the archive files and we've lost the indexes. Okay, so here's my scenario. I'm here on the reload server, and I say, okay, disaster recovery, we're going to point to the database that's over on the retain server, okay, because we're imagining that this database doesn't happen to be on the retain server. It's over on some other location, 10.1.272, and so I'm going to say use that one, but use the local data. Okay, so here's my credentials to get in, and I just click on Enable Disaster Recovery. Okay, so when I click on that and I enable disaster recovery, it says, hey, just wait for about 5 minutes. Now, just, in my particular system, I only have about 2 million items in my system. It's a rather small system. And so it takes, just a little bit more than a minute to load up. And so we're just going to wait here for about a minute's time, and we're going to show you, what goes on. And so what it's doing in the background is it's basically giving the directive to retain to start up the retain server. And so it's effectively issuing the command. This server is on Linux, and so it's just issuing the command rc retain tomcat 7 start. And so that's what we're waiting for that to happen. And in fact, I'll just bring this to the forefront. Those of you that are familiar with Linux, you'll recognize some of this stuff. What I'm doing is I'm just tailing the Catalina out file in the retain. You see that? So var log retain tomcat 7 Catalina out. And so I'm just tailing that, and that gives me a sense of whether or not it's come up. And sure enough, it has come up. And so I can click on use the, in fact, let me just show you here. See how it says server startup in milliseconds. That's the verbiage that tells me that it's actually loaded, so I don't have to wait for the full 5 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here. And so now, if I go to search messages, okay, here we go. Here is this message from earlier today. Now, let me just explain the architecture here. I'm using the database off of the live system, but I'm using blobs locally. So this right here is a blob, okay? This message content is a blob, and this is an attachment, and there we go. All right, there's this attachment, and there's me viewing it, okay? Let's see if this item, oh, yep, the item got in through the mirror. So you remember that just a moment ago, I said I created this item, and the mirror kicked in and replicated this item immediately, and since we're using the database off of retain, I was able to see it here, and the index and the blob content was also replicated over to my reload for retain server. So I have this in its entirety, okay, in the little program that I wrote. So really good stuff. Okay, so that's our first demonstration that we are now in disaster recovery mode. I'm over on the right server. So anyways, we're now in disaster recovery mode, and we've got that data. I was actually expecting some lights to be on here. The demo gods aren't with me. Usually we see this thing light up. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and I'm not quite sure why we don't see the lights. Oh, okay, well there we do, and for some reason we didn't see them. Okay, so what's cool is when you're in disaster recovery mode, it's got this ambulance that lights up to show you that you're in disaster recovery mode, and it's a toggle. To turn it off, we just turn off that button, okay? All right, so that's how simple it is to use a disaster recovery mode. So there's two different modes, and let's talk about that. There's two different modes that you can be in. There's what we call use the local retain server, okay, and then there's configure disaster recovery. And what this does for you is it gives you two different approaches that you can take to the data that you want to challenge. You can say, hey, I want to just full on act like we're in disaster recovery mode, and for example, in this scenario, the MySQL database is at localhost, okay, whereas in the scenario in which I'm using the local retain settings, so right here, use local retain server, when I'm using that, I'm saying, no, you go and use this database over here at this other location. So you have two scenarios that you can define. And so if you ever just want to go in and you want to use your retain server, just because, remember we talked about this notion of, hey, I just want to use the other retain server over on the reload server. You can do that very simply here without having to use the MySQL database that's been imported over, or let's say you didn't tell it to do that import of the MySQL database, or let's say the MySQL database is older because it was imported over 24 hours ago, but you want to use, you know, the database that's current inside of retain, and you've got the mirror functionality going on, and so you just want to, you know, use the retain server over here without being a disaster recovery scenario. You would just do start the local retain server right here. Okay, so you'd click on that, and again, so what we're doing here is we're not in disaster recovery mode, and we're using a different method. We're using right here this method, using the database that's pulling from, you know, the live retain server. Okay, so it sits there and it says, hey, wait for 5 minutes, and then you can go ahead and use the local retain server, and that's going to take about a minute or so for that to happen. So that's another thing that you can do is you can use it, or you can be in disaster recovery. Okay, I know these are kind of new concepts and I'm probably not explaining it well, but now there's a third approach with this kind of disaster recovery. Here's what I want to demonstrate for you is instead of using the live database, I'm now going to say, hey, let's use localhost. Okay, so let me explain what we're going to see here is remember there's three components. You've got your database, you've got your indexes, and you've got your blobs. Okay, and the database has been imported in because of this auto reload MySQL database. Okay, because it's been imported in, when I click on disaster recovery, I'm now using the database right there on the reload server, and I could completely bring down this retain server. I mean, I can shut it off, and there's no dependency upon the database because the database is entirely contained here on this reload server. Okay, so I'm going to say enable disaster recovery and wait for that to happen over on this third reload server. Okay, so, and I'll just show you here, I'm tailing the log for this particular server, and so we can see that retain is loading up, and once we do that, we can log in, and then let's see what we're going to see. So let me tell you what we will see. Okay, in the reload for retain agent, I've got the reload for retain agent configured. The mirroring agent is replicating data to 10.1.274, and it's also replicating the data to 10.1.273. That's this server, and I closed down the other, and that's this server. Okay, so reload 1, reload 2, but it's not mirroring to this reload 3 server. Okay, it's not being mirrored over to this server. And so on this server, because mirroring isn't happening, we're going to see things as of the last backup. So you remember that item that I said, hey, this is mirrored, you know, send this across? That's not going to be over here on this reload server because we're acting as though, you know, the backup goes on like once a day or something like that, and it gets replicated off here to the partner cloud. So I'm not going to see that stuff that was mirrored. I'm going to only see things as of the last backup. Okay, and so let's pull back up our window here. Okay, sure enough, we can see that it's loaded. So I'm going to go here and say use the retain server, and I'm going to log in here. Okay, I'm going to go to search messages, and I'll go to last 3 days. We're going to say mail, and there, sure enough, you can see here that because the backup went on, but this isn't being mirrored over, it's as of my last backup that I have the content. And so I can go in here. Let's test searching for this. So I'm going to just do that. bink, and there we go. We can see that we can search for the item, and so we open that up, and there's that blob, and then I say open here, and there's that blob. So that's all been replicated to this third server. It can stand entirely alone, completely independent of the other server, and we can do that on. So remember, we've got this on-site reload server here. We can go here and we can say, you know what, because I've imported those MySQL databases also in the backup settings, I've said, hey, auto reload the retained server. So if we lost our live server, I'd just go in here, I'd say localhost, and we can say enable disaster recovery. When he comes up, he's standing entirely alone, completely separate of the production retained server, and so we could bring this down and no problem. And in fact, you probably are saying, hey Tay, why don't you bring that down? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over to this server, okay, and I'm going to do RC well, let's just do a RC retain Tomcat stop. Okay, and so we're now simulating as though this server's down, it crashed or we had a disaster, we've lost the server. And so you'll see here that we still have absolutely no dependency upon that retained server being up. And in fact, I'm going to go here and I'm going to say shutdown. Or let's just do reboot. Okay, all right. And so that server will come down, and again, just so you can see that I'm okay. Okay, so you can see that we lost the server. Okay, it shut down, but now we're over here. Okay, and we're still fully using our server, so I wanted you to see that there wasn't any tricks that I'm doing, and the reason it's taking so long is when I send it into a search for, okay, there we go, and so we're completely up and functioning even though our retained server here is completely down. Okay, so we've demonstrated that. We demonstrated mirroring. That was a key thing that I wanted you to see. I've pretty much demonstrated everything that I expected to do so. Now, I wonder if there might be questions. I'm going to look over in my Skype and see if we've got any questions. I'd like to start answering those. And so, not yet. Okay, no questions as of yet. Okay, so. Let's see here. Since there's not any questions yet, I guess I'm going to just talk for a moment about setting this all up and how this is architected. Okay, so there's two components to reload for retain. You have the agent and you have the server. Okay, now I've taken the agent down, so let me see if I can. Okay, good. The agent came back up. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the agent software, and here we go. When you configure the agent, you basically indicate where your servers are, and so here we've got there's different kinds of backup jobs. There's a backup job, there's what's called a suspend job, a resume job, and a mirroring agent. The purpose of the suspend job and the resume job is I found that when customers go to implement reload for retain, the very first time that it gets a backup, it takes quite a while. I'm no better than other backup software the very first time around in that I need to get everything one time. And then after that, everything else is an incremental. Based on queries to the database, we find that there's new information vis-a-vis the database instead of searching around on the disk, okay? And so anyways, when that goes on, that can take weeks. I've had for customers that were larger, and so with this suspend functionality, you can say, hey, go in and suspend between this time period and then resume at this other time period. So so we have backup jobs, suspend jobs, mirroring agent. Okay, I finally got a question that came in, so I'm going to wrap this up in a moment. And so, sorry, go back over here. No, sorry, I messed that up. There we go. All right. So this backup job then, what you do is when you define it, you say this is where the data is on the local retain server, and then you say this is where you replicate it to. And I'm replicating the data to 3 other servers, to this one, 10.1.273, and then 10.1.274, and 10.1.275, okay? And then you say, what do I want to back up? And we're backing up everything, and we're even saying, hey, go ahead and back up the MySQL database because we can do that, okay? And then we just say, when that happens, and we enable the schedule, and that's as simple as it gets. It's a very slick architecture. It's all wizard driven, and you can make multiple jobs that do multiple things. So you could have a job that runs just once a week that sends it off to Timbuktu, or jobs that run multiple times in the day. You can even put in cron jobs. There's a whole cron architecture that you can use where you can use custom commands and so forth to call different job types. So anyways, that's pretty advanced. You want to look at the documentation for that. Okay, and so now let's come to some questions that I see here. Here we go. Question is, everything you've shown included in Reload, or are there modules that must be purchased separately? So let's talk about that. So there's a lot of people that know about Reload, traditionally Reload for GroupWise. That's its own piece of software, and then there's Reload for Retain, which is really just a module that snaps into the Reload server. And what you're seeing here is that these servers here are, they can host Reload for GroupWise and Reload for Retain, but the way I've architected them is they're just hosting Reload for Retain. And there's, in fact, functionality that you can go in. You see here, web administration and system preferences, you can say show only Reload for Retain server controls. And so when we do that, we have a very different look to Reload versus when we don't have that. So if we were to go here and we were to say disable this, then when I go back to home, okay, here, I think it does this. Yeah, there we go. So then you have kind of this traditional view that a lot of you are familiar with, Reload for GroupWise. So you can use your Reload for GroupWise, or you can just have this be just a Reload for Retain server. And I'm going to go back to making that just a Reload for Retain server. So yes, it is a separate purchase, and here we go. There we go. Now we're back to just Reload for Retain. So it is a separate purchase that you have to make. It's just a license. When you implement that license, that then enables this panel in Reload. So good question. Any other questions? So something while we're waiting for questions, something that I'd like to encourage, I know there's a lot of folks out there that work with partners, and perhaps there's a lot of partners on the call. I'd highly recommend that you consider, those of you who have data centers, that you make your customers aware and have them consider the notion of backing up to your data center. It's perfectly feasible, and particularly we find that a lot of our customers are on MySQL, and that's where it's just a beautiful solution, because since we can export that MySQL database and then import it over automatically, each night or whatever interval that you'd like, when that happens, you have a fully functional retain server over in another location, that's extremely valuable. And so that's something that you as partners can offer to your customers. And so I'm really into this idea. There's a saying in the Marines, the United States Marines, one is none and two is one. I really think that applies to backups. I think it applies to locations. I think it's always good to get a backup that's off-site. Okay, I've got another question coming in. I'm just seeing it being typed right now, I think, inside of Skype. I'm just waiting for that to come through. Okay, what's the feedback you've received from the first customers using Reload for Retain? Yeah, so absolutely delighted. The primary concern from the customers who've implemented Reload for Retain was the speed at which their backups were going. And they were taking so long to get backups, and that's the primary thing that they like about it. This version 2, what's extremely attractive is one of my version 1 clients said, hey, this is really neat and stuff, but what if we have a disaster, what's the procedure? And so I had to write up this very complicated procedure as to, what to do to make this happen. Well, with Reload for Retain 2.0, you do have to install Retain, and there are some manual things that you need to do, but there's a lot of other things that are extremely automated. And so the ability to have push-button disaster recovery, I think, is going to be very attractive. And in fact, that was a deterrent for people, because they said, well, they effectively wanted to do what we just done, challenge the backup, and unless they can easily challenge the backup, they didn't see as much value. So I think that that's going to be an extremely attractive thing to people. So yeah, universally, the customers who have implemented Reload for Retain are very, very pleased with it. No more questions. We can wrap it up. Thank you. Thank the audience. Okay. Well, great. I'm getting my prompters from a guy. Hey, thank you so much, everyone, for coming and learning about Retain and Reload for Retain, and appreciate your time, and be looking forward to helping you implement Reload for Retain if you so need it. Thank you. Bye-bye.